Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be back at our regular monthly discussions after the summer break. Your hosts today are myself and Marcia. Andris Piebalgs gives his apologies. He's away at a briefing session for accession countries because Andris was one of the accession negotiators for his own country, so he has some valuable experience to impart there. So today we have a session that I'm really looking forward to on the REDIII. We're very much looking forward to Edith's comments in particular. Edith is I think Edith, I'm correct, Deputy Head of Unit responsible for the REDIII, which has been a mammoth undertaking. The title of it is REDIII basically, but I'm gonna change the title. And the title we have is Does the Emperor Wear Any Clothes? Because part of the discussion today is, are we going to get there? Marcia has been kind enough to offer to introduce our speakers.
Sure. So today with us, we have Edith Wolfer, as you mentioned, so she's the Deputy Head of Unit at the DG Energy Decarbonization and Sustainability of Energy Sources. Then we have Lorenzo Pirelli. He's the team leader in the Performance and Audit Division of the European Court of Auditors. For the panel, we do have Jessie Scott from the REDIII School. She's an adjunct professor there. We also have Peter De Poel. He's a senior auditor at E3G. And we have also James Watson, Secretary General at Eurogas. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. So Edith, we're really looking forward to hear your take on this mammoth new piece of legislation. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us here today, Edith.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Let me now try to share my screen because, and then I'm all. So here we are. Share. Sorry. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that before. So good morning, everyone. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. Christopher, you're partly right. Our unit is in charge of parts of the Renewables Directive. We share this with another unit, but all of us have been working together to get this mammoth work over the finishing line. And now my computer is doing weird things. Do you see the slides actually?
Yep, we see the slides.
I hope, yes. Okay, good. Okay, so thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. And I'm going to try to give you an overview where we stand time-wise, where we stand with the process, where we came from, and how we actually have gone through this mammoth task over the last more than 2 years to get the Renewables Directive towards the adoption, because I will come back to that. It's not fully adopted yet. There's still some work to do to get the final directive out in the official journal. So just let me quickly set the scene to also remember for all of us where we come from. Those of you who have been around for a while know that for the 2020 targets, the European Union has decided on national targets. These were binding national targets. But then in the discussions for the post-2020 framework, there was the view that this would be too complicated again to give national targets, and that we should actually use the potential of the European Union best, meaning use the technologies, use the energy where it's best located. For example, put the windmills where the wind blows and the solar panels where the sun shines most. So for the post-2020 framework, at that stage, we were still only talking about 2030. The European Union has decided for a new target, which was at the time 32%, up from the 20% which we had for 2020. And this was enshrined in the Renewables Directive, which we now refer to as REDIII. and this was adopted in 2018. But then 2019, a new commission came, and we have decided on the European Green Deal. And with this European Green Deal, also for climate neutrality up to 2050. So this obviously, because the 2050 targets before were lower when it came to greenhouse gas reductions. So now obviously the climate law and the Fit for 55 needed an increase in the renewable share, which then with the Fit for 55 proposals, and this also included a proposal for the Renewable Directive in July 2021, and where we would actually have proposed a minimum 40% share to be tackled or to be implemented by 2030. Following the war in the start of the war in the Ukraine, also another element came in, not just reducing the decarbonization, but also the independence, the energy independence of the European Union. And there again, renewables was seen as a very important share of the challenge, or how to actually address the challenge. And therefore, in the REPowerEU communication, the European Union actually suggested to increase the renewables targets even further. So we would, in that proposal, we suggested to go for 45% renewable share across the European Union by 2030, which is in line still with the goal for 2050 of a climate neutral European Union, but also would help better to replace fossil fuels coming in particularly from Russia. So in this proposal, and I will come back to permitting later, we also suggested accelerated permitting. There was then also an emergency regulation on permitting, which I'm not going to come back, not going to address here. But then the negotiations continued, and finally, in a very long 14 hours night session, came to a conclusion or revision of the Renewables Directive with a provisional agreement end of March with when it comes to the target, a 42.5 renewable share target, plus 2.5%, so this would be binding on European level, plus a 2.5% aspirational target to in total come up to the 45% as proposed in REPowerEU. This was clearly a political agreement, a political compromise to get this target achieved. So it would be for 20 also the guide of minus 55%, which was proposed earlier. So as I already mentioned, this should not only tackle climate change, we should also reduce the dependence on fossil energy, but also meet international obligations, increase energy security, etc., etc. Why am I talking about a provisional agreement? Because the proposal has not been finally adopted. So we have now last week got the adoption in the European Parliament and the plenary session, but we are still waiting for the Council. So you see on the process slides here that COREPER plans to sign it off next week, and then formal adoption by the Council on the 9th of October before it can actually then be signed in the plenary in the October 2 session later in October. The directive would then enter into force 20 days after it was published in the official journal. So we expect entry into force somewhere end of November, beginning of December. And then the transposition deadline of 18 months to get so that the member states actually put their laws into order. There are some exceptions to this, and most of them are actually, or all of them are related to. So here, it's, because of the urgency of the issue, and also before the emergency regulation has actually a deadline or an expiry date, we are of the opinion that these provisions of the directive, which are mirroring the emergency regulation, should be transposed by the time the emergency regulation ends. Here, just again, an overview of the targets. I'm not going to go into more detail here because I mentioned already most of the issues I wanted to raise here. Two issues of information when it comes to the 2020 target. The latest verified data of the member states show that we will have a 22.1% renewable share, or achieve the 22.1% renewable share in 2020. This is obviously a little bit better than expected due to the reduced economic activity in 2020 due to COVID, but we would have still overachieved the 20%.
Sorry, Edith, we lost your voice, at least from my side. I cannot hear you anymore.
Hello, Edith.
Can you hear us, Edith?
Hello, Edith. We don't hear you. You're muted, Edith.
Okay. Now
no,
again?
Yeah.
Do you hear
now
me again?
I hear you.
Don't
perhaps,
know what my computer has done.
do you want to try sharing again? Then
yes. Yeah. Okay. Share screen. Oh, come on. Sorry about these technological things, but as I said before, Zoom is not always easy for us, unfortunately. So
no problem.
it always
happens to
takes
us
some
all.
time to get this done. the funds of on then. Okay, you see it again and you hear me again.
We're back again. Thank you.
Good, great. Okay. Okay, I was just talking about the 2020 targets, and then we were able to overachieve the 20%, which was set for 2020, not only due to COVID, but also due to quite some efforts by the member state. And at the moment, we are actually in the process that member states have to revise their national energy and climate plans, which is a requirement from the governance regulation for 2030, where member states actually have to provide us with their intentions on what amount of renewable energy they want to actually, or they're planning to build for 2030. So we will see at the end of this year, when we have all national energy and climate plans in, where we are towards the 2030 target, including the new revised Renewable Directive, which obviously is not yet mandatory or not yet binding on the member states, but we hope that member states will already pledge for this level. Anyway, they will have to revise the national energy climate plans next year, as over the next month. So the final national energy and climate plans, the new ones, will have to be presented next year, and then the 42% are already binding. So I've only talked about the headline targets so far, and I'm not going to go through all these targets you see on this slide, but we actually have a multitude of targets in the meantime. I mean, on many sectors, the idea was, if we set sectoral targets, this would give a push to the sector, this would give a push to renewables in this particular sector. And therefore, we have a mix of binding and indicative targets across the whole renewable sector. Just to name a few, when it comes to transport, we have a greenhouse gas reduction target of minus 14.5%, or member states have to provide for at least 29% renewables in transport. This was again an outcome of the negotiations that member states can actually choose between either a greenhouse gas reduction target or a share of renewables in the transport sector. Another important target is actually the combined sub-targets for advanced biofuels and renewable fuels of non-biological origins, RFNBOs, which is at 5.5%, and a minimum of 1 percentage point for RFNBOs. When it comes to heating and cooling, which is obviously very closely linked to the Energy Efficiency Directive, there an annual increase of 0.5 percentage points is foreseen for 2025. But then in order to actually align the pace with REPowerEU, the increase would have to be higher, 1.1 percentage point for the remainder of the decade. And then in order to actually provide for this, member states will have to take a couple of measures which are also prescribed for in the Renewables Directive, looking at plans and mapping, etc., etc. When it comes to buildings, a quite ambitious, but even although indicative target was set there. There should be a national share of 49% renewables in buildings, and so the energy consumption in the building sector. Again, here there's a very close link to the European buildings, the Buildings Directive, which is still being negotiated, finalized, negotiated, and again here a very important element of delivering on our renewables targets can be found. And finally, some new measures have been proposed for industry, because industry is actually has 32% of the overall energy consumption, and therefore it's quite important that member states provide measures for the industry to boost their renewable uptake. And I think the most important one and the most debated target of these is actually the binding target on RFNBOs for 2030, which is at 42%, and 60% for 2035. So here, quite a high level, or at least from some consider quite high level of a mandatory RFNBO target was set by the co-legislators. How are we going to actually fulfill these targets? Of course, we can have targets, but if targets do not come with measures, it will not be possible to actually achieve them, probably. So the Renewables Directive also prescribes quite a lot of measures. I'm going to come back to permitting and to the sustainability criteria for bioenergy in a moment. On this slide, I would just like to address the other 4 elements when it comes to energy system integration. This is mainly about how to facilitate actually electrification of the system, and how can this actually be incentivized across all sectors. This is really looking at things related to access to grid, provision of data, batteries, e-vehicles, and this kind of issues. Energy purchase agreements is what we were talking about in the past as power purchase agreement. It has been extended also to other energies, in particular gas. So there are some new obligations both for the member states and the Commission, with the most important one being actually to assess and remove barriers for power energy purchase agreements to be implemented. This is also very closely linked to cross-border cooperation, actually. Member states will have an obligation to actually set a mandatory cooperation framework in the legislation on joint projects with other member states for the production of renewable energy. However, what is not mandatory is actually the number of projects. So member states should go for 2 joint projects with another member state, for at least 1 other member states by 2030. And for the bigger member states, also a 3rd project should be implemented by 2033. So this is some obligation to do more on this, in particular to have a framework, but unfortunately, our wish to have a mandatory target for how many joint projects the member states have to do did not go through in the negotiations. When it comes to guarantees of origin, which was also quite a debated issue, here the main issue is actually that member states can go for more granular and closer to real-time guarantees of origin. We also want to make sure that the integration of guarantees of origin and the union database will be enabled. And there's also the link to the former power purchase agreements and now energy purchase agreements, which has to be improved. Permitting, as I hinted in the beginning, is a very important issue. This is one of the main hurdles member states often tell us for the development of renewables in the member states. So therefore, the Commission last year, in the context of REPowerEU, also made an emergency regulation on fast-tracking permitting for renewables. And the most of these provisions have been mirrored now in the Renewables Directive to actually keep them beyond the expiry date of the emergency regulation. And the first step in this area is actually that member states have to map the necessary areas for the national contributions towards the 2030 renewables target and designate a particularly suitable what's called now renewable acceleration areas. These renewable acceleration areas should be those areas where, again, wind, solar, other renewables can be are best suited to be built. And for these areas, a simpler and faster permitting procedure would be actually should be implemented. So quite short time periods, 1 year for new projects, and if it's about repowering a renewables plant, even 6 months, because there's already something and there are some conditions for positive silence under certain conditions. So there is actually really a very strong push that member states speed up the permitting. And there's also a lot of work going on together with the member states to also ensure that there is enough human resources to deal with these permitting procedures. And to come to my final slide, which is quite a difficult one, or was quite a difficult one in the negotiations. These are the sustainability criteria for bioenergy. The issues that with an increased renewable target, we obviously also will have an increased use of bioenergy, including forest biomass. When we look at the figures concerning forest biomass actually provides for 10% of the EU final energy consumption and about 60% of the renewables consumption. And therefore, obviously, we are concerned that there should not be just any kind of renewable production, forest harvesting going on, but forest harvesting or also other bioenergy harvesting should be done only when it complies with certain sustainability criteria, which have been partly already introduced through REDIII, but have now been strengthened in a targeted way in the revised directive. Some of the areas which are quite important is that sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions savings criteria are actually now applicable to installations equal or larger than 7.5 megawatt already. This is in the current directive, it's still 20 megawatt, that these criteria also apply under certain conditions and phase in periods for existing installations. So also these will be covered. Then we have extended the so-called no-go areas, which have been introduced in REDIII for the agriculture biomass, also to forest biomass. And some of these, some new no-go areas have been included, in particular so-called old growth forests and heathland. Member states will also have to provide international energy and climate plans, how they're actually going to ensure consistency with their LULUCF obligations. LULUCF stands for land use change and forestry obligations, so that member states have to provide actually measures, policies on how this is actually going to work, in particular towards more sinks and as a carbon sink and this kind of issues. And finally, now 2 more issues. The one is the cascading principle, where some elements are defined on how forest biomass should be actually used, what kind of use should be done with woody biomass before it is actually used for energy production. And finally, some provisions have been introduced when it comes to direct financial support, phasing out of subsidy for electricity-only installations using forest biomass, etc. So there is actually quite a lot of sustainability criteria which have been introduced, but we believe that these are necessary to also ensure that biodiversity and biodiversity will be ensured. I'll stop here. It was, I know, a very quick overview of what has been changed in the directive and where we actually are standing now. So we hope that member states will actually go for a quick implementation or transposition of this directive, because otherwise, and I've come back to the question of Christopher, whether we'll manage to actually achieve all these targets. If member states do not transpose this very quickly, then indeed it might be difficult. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Edith. I'd call it a terrific presentation rather than a quick one. Can I just a couple of questions? I must admit, I never realized that wood accounted for such a high percentage of our renewable energy. And I'm sure a detailed impact assessment was done. And I absolutely understand why the biomass sustainability criteria are included. Makes absolute sense. Of course, we don't want all of our pristine forests being knocked down in order to meet the RES target. Are there any figures, or do you have else off the top of your head as to the likely effects that the biomass sustainability criteria will have in terms of limiting the ability of member states to use this? Will it cause a reduction in the amount of wood used for RES?
That is a very sensitive question, a very politically sensitive question. Actually, this was one of the main issues which we have had actually for discussions at the last trilogue, because indeed there are some member states who believe that this will impact too much on their ability to use forest biomass in the national energy mix. And obviously, when it comes to the high share, a lot of it is used for heating as well, but it's still energy consumption. We believe, yes, it will have an impact. We don't have any figures because obviously the final compromise has not been impact assessed. It's only the original proposal. But we still believe that it leaves quite a leeway for member states to use biomass, forest biomass, in their national energy mix. But it will obviously, hopefully, have some impact.
Perhaps another question. This is a question that always is raised when I talk about the REDIII, which is it's an indicative target, the 42%, not like the 2009 directive. And
it's a binding target, please.
Sorry, okay, apologies. It's binding on the EU, but there's no immediate legally binding target per member state. Yeah, sorry. And I had a look this morning at the Commission's website on NECAPs, National Energy and Climate Plans. And I think I'm right in saying most member states should have provided the draft by now, but there's only a handful there. And the handful that are there are not encouraging in terms of achieving the 42%. Hungary is proposing 29%, Italy 40.5%, the Netherlands 27%, but expects 30%, Slovakia 23%, Slovenia 30 to 35%, Spain 48%, which is higher, but okay, Spain has huge resources. What will happen if, with the kneecaps, the Commission sees that the EU is not going to meet this target? And what is the consequence? Because obviously the EU can't take itself to court. So what is the consequence of not being on the trajectory or achieving the trajectory at EU level?
Yeah, I think this is the big question which we are getting since the 2018 directive and the governance regulation. And I mean, the governance regulation is one of the reasons, or one of the reasons we have the governance regulation is exactly this. So the first thing, I agree with you. At the moment, the targets which member states, or the contributions which member states have pledged, are not very high. But obviously, when they were preparing the plans, at least on a binding level, only the 32% were so basically at the moment only the 32% are binding. Therefore, what we will do in the observations which the Commission has to do in the by the end of the year is actually we will encourage or urge member states to increase their renewable pledges. And we are in permanent contact already with the member states through issues like concerted actions, through political level discussions, etc., so that member states actually increase already their pledges towards the 42.5% target. What happens if it's not achieved? This is actually the million-dollar question. I mean, there are some elements in the governance regulation, how this is dealt with, how the share of not achieving the target has to be shared with the other member states, among the member states. So there are mechanisms in the governance regulations, which I don't remember all of them in detail, how this gap filling mechanisms can be implemented. Or there is a gap filling mechanism, let's put it that way.
There's 3 questions in the Q&A, perhaps I can give you. Firstly, are the sectoral targets also binding? So I guess that's transport and refumbos. That was the first one.
Some of them.
Okay, why don't I give you that one first, and then I'll ask the other 2.
Some of them. I think it's the easiest. I mean, on the slide I actually indicated, and I guess the slides will be available on the slide. It's indicated everywhere whether they're indicative or binding. So, for example, the overall transport target is binding. The overall industry target of RFMBOs is binding, but some of the other ones are indicative. So I've provided there the information, what is indicative, what is binding on the slide, but I don't want to go through all of them because otherwise we'll be here tomorrow.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions, I think possibly even 3 questions on refumbos. And I just did some maths. So currently we consume 8 million tons of hydrogen. 60% is 4.8 million tons. The US ERA gives $3 a kilo subsidy for green to make it competitive with grey hydrogen. And that's more or less the same numbers as the Commission's impact assessment as to how much subsidies will be needed. So that means we'll need 14.4 billion euros a year to meet the 4.8 million tons. So it's a really challenging target. And so one of the questions was from Federico on Article 22A industry targets. Is the Commission planning any action to support member states in implementing the refumbos sub-targets? And there's an additional question is, will information on the expected production and consumption of refumbos, stroke green hydrogen, be included in NECAPs too? So how much detail will member states have to give in relation to how they're going to achieve these refumbo targets in their NECAPs? And a final question was, is there any timetable for the remaining delegated acts to be adopted? Okay, I'll start with the last one because that's the easier one. So for the REDIII, almost all of the delegated acts have been adopted in the meantime, so that's the easy answer.
I mean, I think there's one about, but this is where we have a deadline, or we had a deadline in September, which still is outstanding, and all the other ones do not have deadlines. So I think there we are good for once. Where the member states have to provide information in their national energy and climate plans on their RFMBOs, yes, they should also provide what kind of green hydrogen production they are planning in the member states. This also is, of course, part of the pledges they are going to do in the national energy and climate plans. And when it comes to support for RFMBO production, I mean, on the one hand, we are planning at the moment an auction, an auction under the Innovation Fund, which will be launched in end of November, which our colleagues in DG Klima are working on particularly these kind of things to help a bit filling the gap of the costs, so to have some support from the Innovation Fund. We are obviously also discussing with other DGs where we can actually use other funds to support hydrogen production. I know several member states also use the Recovery and Resilience Fund to actually support hydrogen. But yes, we are very well aware that this is an enormous challenge, and we are not only aware of it, we are also following very closely with member states and with the industry as well on what we actually can do to get the hydrogen market up to speed. And obviously in parallel, my colleagues are also still negotiating the hydrogen and gas market package, which will also help getting hydrogen off the ground. So I think there's some regulatory work ongoing. There's some lot of discussions ongoing how as an EU we can support it, but a lot of this will also have to come from industry, from member states, and again, discussions are ongoing. We don't have a final answer yet.
Many thanks. I'm going to ask you 3 more questions, then I'm going to have to move on because we could ask you questions all day on this. There's so much to ask. Question from Anne Hartman. Hi, Anne. Is there any obligation or approach or something for member states to adapt their distribution to the development of rooftop PV? Because if we've got a target of 49% for resin buildings, which sounds, and perhaps that's another question, 49% in buildings sounds incredibly ambitious to me, but that's probably just a feeling. So is that realistic? And Anne's question is an obligation for member states to adopt their distribution network. There's a second question from sorry, I'm going to mispronounce your name completely. Zavita. Sorry, must have missed that completely. Who asks, is there an explicit or implicit priority for biomass use? Which she has seen in some national energy climate plans to use it for biomethane and not biogas. And a third question, which I'm often asked, or I hear people asking, that if I see the national energy and climate plans, and so Hungary 29%, Netherlands 27%, is really low, in my opinion. Okay, and I assume it's lower than indicative fair share numbers. If the Commission says to Hungary and the Netherlands, in this case, in their comments on the National Energy and Climate Plan, sorry, your contribution is way too low, you have to do more, and they say, sorry, not doing it, not interested, that's going to be our National Energy and Climate Plan, can the Commission actually do anything? Or does the member state just publish it and then leave the EU in difficulty?
Okay, this time I start with the beginning. On the ambition on buildings, yes, I agree. It's a very ambitious target. Is it achievable? If we wouldn't believe that it's achievable, we wouldn't have proposed it. But yes, we need measures in the Energy Efficiency Directive, in the Performance of Buildings Directive, etc., to also support this. And this is also why at least the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Renewables Directive were proposed at the same time, so that they can go hand in hand. And the Energy Efficiency Directive has already been published in the official journal, so there are also a lot of provisions in there to support more renewables in the buildings. But yes, it's a very ambitious target. On the obligation on distribution systems, and I will have to come back to you. I don't know this from the top of my head. I will have to reread again what has been in the final compromise. Because also the network access was quite, we had quite some discussions on this. On priority biomass use, no, there is no priority in the directives on how biomass is used. But of course, with the EU also having proposed a biomethane action plan and a new target of 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane production in 2030 to support again the energy independence from the Union of the Union. So of course, several member states will have this as a priority in using their biomass. And again, I'm coming back to the governance regulation, to your last question, Christopher. There are mechanisms in the governance regulation, and I agree, I should have reread that before this presentation. I should have expected those questions. I do not remember all the detailed rules and all the detailed obligations member states have there. But in the past, and this is already for the 2030 framework, when the first national energy and climate plans were presented, it was actually mainly the peer pressure which led to higher targets. And it will be probably in the first instance a political issue where the ministers or even higher up will discuss how we do in order to fill the gap. We do have some obligations, some rights as well to impose on the member state something, but I have to confess, I don't remember it by heart. I'm happy to come back to you on this question. I just don't remember it now.
Many thanks, Edith. I mean, there's additional questions that come in, but I'm going to have to move to other speakers. Thank you so much for joining us, Edith, and congratulations on an absolutely fabulous presentation. I hope you'll be able to stay with us so that we can pose other questions as they develop. Our next speaker is Lorenzo from the Court of Auditors. The court did an absolutely fabulous report on basically, does the emperor have any clothes? So Lorenzo, we're really looking forward to see your presentation, or hear your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christopher, and good morning, everybody. I'm Lorenzo Pirelli. I was the head of this task, this performance audit on EU and climate targets. I will now share the screen. So for those you don't know the European Code of Auditors, we are actually the smallest of the 5 institutions, but we are the one which is checking what the other institutions are doing. And in particular, in this audit, we check to what extent the Commission as member states managed to achieve the 2020 targets, and to what extent we are on the good track to achieve the 2030 ones. So as you can see already from the title, the main message is that the 2020 targets were achieved. As Edith said, there were factors that helped, like the recession caused by COVID or the financial crisis before. But overall, we had the feeling that there was little indication that actions to reach the 2030 targets will be sufficient for the moment. And this is due to a number of factors that I will describe in detail. So, okay, as anticipated, and now we all know, okay, we reached the 2020 targets, especially for greenhouse gas emission. There was, let's say, no problem to reach the 2021, and now targets are becoming increasingly challenging. So this is a slide on renewable energies that also Edit shows. So as everybody can see, the 2020 year was, of course, a special year due to the COVID recession. We know that this share of renewable energy is calculated based as denominator on the energy consumption. So since the energy consumption decreased, the share of renewable energy artificially increased in 2020. That's why it was also a bit higher. And for energy efficiency, which has been historically the most difficult target to reach, 2020, the European Union reached it, but until a few months before, there were doubts from everybody, including the Commission, that the target would have been reached. So I think there is quite some agreement that the 2020 target for energy efficiency would not have reached without the extraordinary situation caused by the COVID. Okay, so to introduce to the topic, our mandate as Court of Auditor is to follow the EU budget, and the EU budget is investing quite a lot of money, around 87 billion per year in 2021-2027 multi-financial framework. However, we have to keep in mind that this is less than 10% of the total investment that is needed to reach the 2030 targets, according to some estimations coming either from the Commission or from the McKinsey group or from other experts. So EU budget is significant, but it's not all. National budget and private budget are expected to make the bulk of the investment, to be clear. So what we tried to assess in our audit was to what extent the achievement of the 2020 target was based on new climate actions rather than external factors. To what extent the EU compares well to other industrialized countries in the world, because it's also important to see things in perspective, and to what extent Commission and Member State drew lesson to create a good framework for achieving the more ambitious 2030 targets. So we focused on the Commission, DG Energy and DG Climate, so the two Director General responsible for this policy, and we focused also on 5 member states, which represent around half of the EU greenhouse gas emissions: Germany, Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Sweden, which also represent a good geographical balance. Okay, so about the achievement of the 2020 targets, so the first item, as I said, we know we reached the 2020 targets. However, the main criticism that we have is that even the Commission did not assess to what extent the progress was a result of policies and to what extent it was a result of external factors. It's not an easy task, but we would have expected a bit more of effort to distinguish between let's say, progress driven by economic cycle and progress given by genuine policies put in place. So when you compare member states, it's also interesting to see that some member states actually managed to reduce a lot their greenhouse gas emissions, but it's quite clear it's because of the economic cycle. So take Greece, one of the countries most affected by the financial crisis. In reality, the emissions per unit of GDP, so using intensity indicators, you have another part of the story which is not necessarily evident when you look at absolute figures. So there are countries on the other hand, like Sweden, which in intensity terms, so emission per unit of GDP, they managed to reduce a lot, like minus 46% their emissions. So what we suggest is to take into consideration also intensity indicators, for example, emission per unit of GDP, emission per capita, to see how member states are progressing also in relative terms. Then the second item we noticed when assessing the achievement of the 2020 targets was some lack of transparency on the so-called flexibilities. So as Edith was anticipating, member states enjoy some level of flexibility on how to reach the target. In simple terms, it means that if one member state is not reaching its own target, it can buy the missing shares from another member state. This is allowed by the regulation. However, we feel that such transfer should be made public, and especially the price at which member states buy missing shares, for example, of renewable energy, should be made public, which was not the case. So as you can see in the graph, this affected only 6 member states, and 5 out of 6 they bought the missing share from other member states. France was the only one which did not achieve its own target and has not yet bought renewable energy shares from other member states. So we point out a lack of transparency in this mechanism. Flexibility can make sense if it helps achieving overall cost effectiveness in Europe, because maybe in Spain there is more sun and etc. But there is no reason not to be transparent and not to disclose the price at which these transactions happen. Then second part about comparison of the EU to the rest of the world. The main message is that in general the EU is doing well, I would say even very well compared to the rest of the world, because if you look at the rest of the world, especially developing countries like China or India, these are the big polluters, and again, in relative terms, the EU shares of global emissions dropped from 15.3 to less than 8% in the last 30 years. So overall, the EU is emitting less in percentage terms. So we are doing better, but other countries in the world are doing worse. However, there is also some caveat to notice that the EU 2020 greenhouse gas emission accounting did not include two important elements. So one is the so-called carbon leakage. So emissions that are recorded in other member states, like outside of the EU, like China, but they occur as a result of trade and are somehow called by the EU, because we are importing washing machines produced in China, to make a simple example. So this is estimated by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission at around 8% of overall EU emissions. So EU emission will be probably around 8% higher if we take into account also emissions we as Europeans cause in the rest of the world. And the second category is emissions from international aviation and shipping. So a flight Paris to Tokyo is not accounted at all in European emissions, and until 2020 not even a flight Paris to Berlin was accounted, because we are member state consider international aviation inside Europe not part of the target. This has been improved in 2030, so international but inside intra-European flights are now part of the target, but still international, so intercontinental flights are not. And these, as you can see in the graph, are going to increase significantly. So this is for sure an issue also for the future to tackle. Positive side about drawing lessons for the 2030 targets. The Commission knows well which sectors contributed to the targets. So it has a good system of recording by sector of emissions. And we know that the reduction of EU emission was mostly driven by sectors covered by the emission trading system. So mainly power supply and industry. On the other hand, emissions from transport, international aviation, and shipping were the one really rising. So I'm happy to see that, as I did say, there are more and more binding targets to try to tackle emissions from transport. Other important point, looking forward, is that, okay, we achieved the 2020 targets, but neither the Commission nor the Member State really know much about the cost and the effects of the actions, so of the policies, of the instruments, of both EU and national policies put in place. So as we already found in a number of audits, even when there is EU funding, for example, a report which was at the task as well on energy efficiency in buildings, basically there was no information on the contribution of EU spending programs to the climate targets, climate and energy targets. So we spend billions of euros to renovate buildings, but we don't know how much energy we save, for example, and this we found in many similar audits. For national funding, it's a bit the same story, in the sense that there is a database run by the Environmental Agency, which lists some 2,000 policies and measures across member states, but it provides basically no data on cost and effects of the measure. Or there is some debate whether it's member state not submitting the data, whether the governance regulation is not requiring member state to submit enough data. The fact is that in the end we know very little on on the cost and effects of the policies put in place. It should be the starting point to improve the future. And even less for private funding. Basically, there is no data, although most of the funding should come from private sources. And when you read Commission documents, it's hoped that there is a good leverage of this private funding. So this also deserves more attention. Now, the main novelty introduced by the government regulations in this decade are the national energy and climate plans, which should be the main instrument to inform about investment gaps, source of funding, and make policies to fill the gap. So basically, they should say how big is the gap, where do we take the money from, and which policies we put in place. However, in the first version, so the one submitted in 2020 by member states, the information was very much incomplete and inconsistent. So we knew very little of where the money should be found and which policy should be implemented. The good news is that the Commission last year provided guidance to tackle such weaknesses for the updated SCPs that member states should have submitted now this summer by 30 June 2023. So we have to see to what extent the situation is improving on. So to sum up, EU reached the 2020 targets, but not only due to its own climate action. So basically, financial crisis and COVID played a big role. The EU compares well internationally, but not all emissions are accounted for because carbon leakage and international aviation and shipping are not part of the target. And thirdly, Commission has a good overview of the sector contribution of the target, but lacks key information on the cost effectiveness of measures, actions put in place to reach the targets. So it's good to have a more ambitious target for 2030, but as Edith says, actions need to follow. And at the moment, from what we found so far, there was little indication that this ambition will translate into sufficient action. So now it's time to turn good promises into real action, let's say. So what we recommend as logical consequence of what we found is firstly, to use the available reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, for example, per unit of GDP or per capita, to assess the drivers of member states' progress, and have the Commission engaging more with member states to improve the performance of the action. So to know if member state is progressing due to the economic cycle or due to the policies put in place. And similarly, in point B, we also recommend to assess and report on member state progress by distinguishing the impact of the policy in place from the impact of external factors. And the last point is to have greater transparency regarding the price of greenhouse gas emission and individual renewable energy share transfers. As I mentioned, the price is the element which is not public, and we don't find a reason to have this lack of transparency. Second type of recommendation is to account for all greenhouse gas emissions that, as Europeans, we cause in the world, which means, on the one hand, for carbon leakage, to assess the possibility of using the data that the Commission will collect via the new carbon border adjustment mechanism, to complement its reporting, to report also on emissions associated with imported goods to the EU. And this was fully accepted by the Commission. And about the other emissions which are not accounted, which are international aviation and shipping, also assessing the feasibility of including them at least in the 2050 targets for climate neutrality. So to be sure that there is sufficient attention on this target as well, that is not forgotten. And then we are proud of reducing our own emissions, but then international aviation emissions will continue increasing significantly. And finally, third type of recommendation, also very relevant in this moment, is to better support member states on achieving the 2030 targets, which means to include in the updated national energy and climate plans consistent information on the expected cost and effects of the policies, which should be the starting point to have a credible plans in place, so to make the plans a bit less strategic and a bit more clear on what they want to achieve, as well on investment needs and funding sources to fill those needs. This was also fully accepted by the Commission. And finally, assess the possibility of enhancing the current system of transfer of emissions and renewable energy shares, including the option of closer aligning the price of transfer with market prices. So this is connecting with recommendation 1C, in which we also advocate for more transparency. So that's all on my side. I'm of course very happy to reply to your questions, and I now look forward for an interesting discussion.
Lorenzo, many thanks indeed. That was terrific. And the report itself, I've read the report and it's really impressive. A couple of questions, if I may. One of the issues that you focus on is what's called carbon leakage. And, you know, in traditional commission speak or whatever, carbon leakage is generally concerned in the ETS. It generally concerned the risk that if we impose carbon costs on EU industry will delocalize, will go somewhere else, and therefore simply emit the same carbon, but will emit it outside the EU rather than EU. If I understand correctly, the definition that the Court of Auditors has taken on carbon leakage is basically the amount, or this is a question, is the definition that the Court of Auditors has taken based on the question, how much CO2 is emitted in the stuff we import? So if I look at the computer screens in front of me, which no doubt came from China, one of them I bought last year, we haven't taken into account that amount of CO2 in saying how much CO2 Belgium has emitted. Is that the point you're raising? And has the court looked at the question whether this amount of embedded carbon, or whatever we're going to call it, increasing or decreasing?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. That's the point of carbon leakage. Of let's say the EU wants literally to say, I think it's the European Green, it uses the word EU wants to be a global leader in climate change, fighting climate change. So if we want to be a global leader, we should also take responsibility for all emissions we cause in the world. So and also this, as you say, this delocalization of activities in the end has other negative consequences on the EU, because jobs grow, etc. So it doesn't make sense to delocalize if and then be proud of reducing emissions. In reality, we are just causing increase of emissions elsewhere. So that's the center point. The good thing is that the new CBAM measure should address this point. So should create a more fair competition between goods produced in the EU, presumably with higher environmental standards, and goods coming from outside the EU. So it should create a fair level of competition. And secondly, about your question whether this carbon leakage is increasing, the answer is it's quite stable over time. So data from JRC shows that over the last decade, it's always around 8%. So there was no big increase in the last years, at least from what the data show. So, but of course, collecting good data is also part of the issue to monitor the phenomenon. That's what we recommend in our recommendation to better follow it.
Okay, so I guess the logical conclusion from what you say is that the EU will therefore need to look at the question, how do we expand the CBAM from steel, cement, hydrogen, ammonia, electricity to computer screens? Would be a logical way of looking at it. One last question for me, because there's still so much ground to cover. one of the biggest criticisms of the Court of Auditors is that the Commission, in your view, has not paid sufficient attention into the relative cost of the different decarbonisation methods. Now, obviously, the Commission has made big efforts in recent years to ensure that all proposals are backed up by an impact assessment. Was the court, so did the court find that these impact assessments were not detailed enough to justify the legislation? So this is a very hard and leading question. But did the court find that the impact assessments were not detailed or well done enough in order to justify the policy decisions that the Commission and the EU has made, not just the Commission, because people, Council and Parliament have adopted the legislation, in terms of policy choices?
Yes, indeed. This is one aspect that we looked at also as the impact assessment, also for the new Fit for 55 package. And actually, we are not the only one having doubts, because even the regulatory scrutiny board of the Commission itself issued at the beginning a negative opinion on the Fit for 55 package. So we have actually a paragraph in our report, which is 83, which I'm reading. We also found that the impact assessment underlying the Fit for 55 package involved several assumptions concerning member states, such as the full implementation of existing policies and full achievement of expected benefits. And also it was quite, let's say, optimistic on the technological advances in energy and transport, including rapid electrification and so on. So our point is that the impact assessment was quite positive, which is okay as an assumption for a policy-making institution like the Commission, but evidence from our previous report shows that assumptions often do not materialize as planned. So member states do not fully implement their policies. Electrification doesn't happen as quickly as planned. We have, for example, a report on that on electromobility. So we have a number of issues which make us a bit skeptical about all the assumptions that are behind the Fit for 55 package. And I must say that also when discussing with member states, member states have troubles to follow the Commission push for higher and higher targets. So being ambitious, it's fine, but if in the end member states and the technological development not manage to follow as much as possible, then we will need to face the other reality that it won't be so easy to achieve the 2030 targets as we hope. So also, let's be honest, I mean, we reached the 2020 targets, which were less ambitious, and also because there were external factors that played a role. So now 2030 target will be marginally, increasingly more costly to reach. So we need to put serious efforts into it. So let's hope that the situation will be, let's say, more positive than what we found. But if you look at 2021 data on emissions, etc., there was a clear rebound effect, which unfortunately doesn't allow us to be that positive in our assessment.
Okay, many thanks indeed, Lorenzo. It's a terrific presentation. We really appreciate it. I'm going to move now to our panelists, who I will do in alphabetical order. So James, I'd like to give all three panelists an opportunity to react to this. And one of the questions, perhaps you might want to look at it in your thoughts, is we see a level of debate on affordability, employment, economic policy, and the Green Deal as the targets start to actually embed. And the President of the Commission raised this issue obliquely rather than face on in the State of the Union speech, where she said, no, we've got to drive ahead, which of course is absolutely right. So James, how do you see I mean, obviously, James is representing the gas industry, but the gas industry, no doubt, is also looking at renewable hydrogen in the future. So, James, how do you see the development here? What are your priorities and the priorities of your members in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for the invitation. And indeed, very interesting presentations. I could pick up one or two points in Lorenzo's, especially around the ETS one, but I'll answer your question instead, Chris, because just to say on that point, there were areas that are not covered by the ETS, like transport and so on and so forth, that were given examples where there was no real progress made, but in principle they've been covered by legislation, things like effort sharing regulation. So it's not they haven't been regulated, so it's a question then of whether or not the regulation was the right one, but that's a different question to what you're asking me. We are very interested in, of course, not just in the developments of hydrogen and the RFNBO activities that are going on under the REDIII, but also the biomethane front. I think that we find that there's probably a certain degree of lack of ambition being shown towards biomethane in the Renewable Energy Directive. It seems to be being put back into the gas package, which I find interesting. It's a renewable energy. REPowerEU is very clear that they want to have 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane by 2030. To answer the question about economics, yes, that's a big undertaking and we'll need a good deal of support, Chris, and that's why we think there should be a specific mention of it. But we find it odd that there was no particular drive from the European Commission to house it there and sort of leave the problem to the gas package. So the gas package will now also pick up renewable energy activities. And this is actually the main point that I wanted to make today. We're majorly concerned about the overlaps and the interactions between all of the different legislation that has come through recently. And we don't know whether or not the European Commission is really aware of how all these overlaps work and what will be the impacts on member states. I'll give one example. If you have the RFNBO target, for example, where you're talking about getting to about 1% of RFNBOs and the 5.5% target for biofuels and hydrogen by 2030, then you also have a target of 1.2% for RFNBOs in maritime by 2030. And our question is, how do these two, how does the member state work out what it's supposed to be doing? There is a different line. Is it 1.2 in maritime? Is that different to the 1%? And I don't know whether or not the European Commission have actually looked at those kind of issues. We also have a question about the cross-border importation of RFNBOs. There's a 70-30 split. Who can claim what? The importing country can claim 70% of the reduced carbon, with 30% the producing country. But that means that, and basically, that importing country only gets 70% of the value. So again, what was the incentive for the country to do that? And why does the producer keep 30 even though it doesn't consume that particular? So we feel there are some inconsistencies. We think there are overlaps. You picked up permitting and enforcement, so I won't raise it, but permitting is another example because ENSIA now has another whole section on permitting and speeding things up, and wind farms that aren't approved in 2 years will automatically be considered to be approved. And how does that link into the permitting that is put into the REDIII? So for us, there seems to be a mishmash of legislation in the current packages. There doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity between how the overlapping nature of these legislative packages has been really understood. And is that all on the member states to understand and clarify to industry who have to invest? To come back to your economic point, Chris, we have to invest in a relatively confusing environment. So from that point of view, I think our members would be very happy if there are more guidance notes that would come out of the European Commission to explain how the interaction of the targets and things like FuelEU, the REDIII, the gas package eventually, how they will all contribute. Do they all count to the same, or are they supposed to be different? And indeed, I think we're going to need a bit of support from the European Commission to finally explain how all of these different legislative acts are actually supposed to be taken by industry and by the member state. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, James. The question popped. Can you explain the 70-30 issue a little more and why it is of concern to you?
Well, it's basically the provisions in REDIII basically saying that when you have this, when you have to have an agreement as well as a sort of cross-border agreement, you import RFNBO. When you actually are doing the accounting for it, you account 70% of the carbon reduction in the importing country, whilst 30 stays in the producing country. Well, is that actually really an incentive to do the importing and undertake all of that work, because you're only able to account for 70% of the value? That's the question. Maybe people will do it. It just seems to us as a genuine question. Has that been impact assessed and understood that was really a reasonable level, and the member states will say, yeah, okay, we'll continue with a cross-border trade? As you understand, in the gas sector, we are very keen on cross-border trade. We've experienced it for a long time. We would see it to be continued under things like RFNBOs, also important for certificates and GOs. But is 70% suitable? And that's a genuine question. And we are, to some extent, perplexed about it. Or will that actually act as a barrier and stop any cross-border activities, the importing, which won't be particularly good for a liquid market?
Many thanks, James. Jesse, what's your take on it, on the issues that were raised today? I mean, one of the questions that was raised in the chat is, and I think quite important for the next commission, that we've seen the EU Recovery Fund, and Bruegel suggests an EU Green Investment Fund, so another 700 billion. Given the US ERA, Inflation Reduction Act, which the US government predicts will cost 300 billion, but Goldman Sachs estimates will cost more than $1 billion in terms of investments of tax credits. What should the EU now do in order to make sure that these targets are met and that there is an economic policy behind it? Because we want to benefit from these targets, not it just being a cost.
So, Chris, the US-Europe competition space, it's a hot topic. I think it's a little off actually where we are today. So let me give you a short headline on that, and then I'd love to pick up a couple of points from the presentations and the discussions so far, if you'll permit. What the US has done is use tax credits, which the EU as an entity cannot do. And it's produced a very simple framework. And that's really clear. The message from business is we like the simplicity of this. So the number one message to Europe is let's look at the toolkit that we do have and the things we can do and make it a lot simpler. I was talking yesterday to a senior figure from a very major energy company in Europe, and they had had a professional expert analyst work for 3 days to produce a flowchart of extraordinary complexity, showing how the various support that's available in the European system towards the same kind of objectives that the ERA has works. It took a professional analyst 3 days to draw up that flowchart. So we are orders of magnitude more complicated. Let's try to simplify. And that's really the ask. Look, Chris, listening to this conversation, there's a couple of other things. We all know that the major challenge to deliver REDIII, to deliver the 2030 targets, looking ahead to 2040 targets, which I'm also worried about, is that a lot of this is now in the hands of the member states. We are dealing with permitting, which is land law, the most ancient thing in human society. And we really have to make some quite radical changes. Then I think there's a number of things happening which we need to worry about. A really clear one is that solar is doing incredibly well. It's doing incredibly well globally. It's doing incredibly well in Europe. And the result is an emerging solar-wind imbalance. The wind sector is struggling. We're building up solar very fast. Well, that gives us an excellent situation in daytime in summer, but raises a whole bunch of major questions about how we are going to balance the system. And there's short-term storage issues, but fundamentally there's a seasonal storage challenge emerging. And I think that's going to hit us within the next couple of years, certainly in the 2030 period. That then leads to how we look at other renewables in the package. I mean, at the moment, we're using some biogas, some biomethane, basically baseload. Surely we should be using it seasonally to back up the power system when the solar is not, as available. We should clearly be pushing much, much harder on the battery space. And yes, battery manufacturing supply chains are going up worldwide, but the business models, the deployment is a big challenge area also in Europe. And here I'm very interested in some of the work that Google are doing on what they call 24/7 clean electricity. So not 100% clean average figures around the year, which of course average out through guarantees of origin, but basically it's 50% clean, 50% fossil consumption in practice at any one major site, such as a Google data center. They are looking at how they can genuinely have hourly matching. That's a big debate in the hydrogen field as well. And there they are realizing that what it does is it drives major investors like Google to look a lot more at batteries, other storage solutions, demand response. So if we are going to be able to deliver the 2030 target, with great respect to the Court of Auditors' excellent report, it's not just a finance question. There's a whole bunch of system design challenges that we've kind of known about and we've talked about over the years, but they're now getting to crunch time. One last thing I must pick up, Chris, bioenergy. I mean, I heard some of the insights from the trilogue process around bioenergy and biomass, particularly forest woody biomass. And the outcome so far is progress, but not great. Why? Because removing wood from forests reduces them as a carbon sink, because if you burn biomass, you produce both CO2 emissions and, by the way, those are on a par with coal as actual emissions. UNFCCC reporting allows us to deal with that differently, but the actual CO2 emissions are up there with coal, and in many cases also CH4, methane emissions from the burn process. And in round numbers, Chris, you said you were surprised earlier that we have around 60% of renewable energy comes from biosources. Well, heating is by far the largest end-use sector, and it's consuming around 75% of all bioenergy in Europe at the moment. Of that, the JRC has numbers which put something around about 37% of that as coming from solid wood burning. There is a lot we can do in the heating sector to improve how we are using bioenergy, ensuring that it's the sustainable sources, and that will then also lead to a deeper, genuine electrification of the heating system. And there, we need to get into some of the balancing issues. So it's not just a question of setting targets and addressing the finance. There's a whole set of interactions between sources and systems, which I'm really, really worried about us being able to deploy for 2030. Stop there.
Many thanks. That was a huge amount of food for thought. Peter, E3G, what's your take on this? How are we going to stitch all these different bits together in a way that's going to benefit the EU and meet the climate targets? So we've got an enormous way to go in 2030. We haven't even started the debate on the 2030 target is the easy bit, not the 2040 target. So what's your take, Peter?
Yeah, no, thanks, and thanks for the invite. And I had sort of started listening to all of this with your initial question about the emperor's close, and I think in the end, I think I'm going with a sort of glass half full. I think he's very quickly getting dressed at the moment. Is my very short answer. I mean, I think yes, the EU is complex. We all know that. The US, by the way, if you look very closely, isn't that particularly clearly organized. I mean, there are some differences, like Jesse just said, but I think there's also a bit of a tendency to see the grass on the other side being greener. I think one thing we shouldn't forget that the RA is actually a response to the EU. I mean, the EU has always been asking the US to step up on climate action, and the RA is the way the US has done that in a way that is politically possible within the US. So I think we should also just recognize that interaction there. But my sort of reflection on all of this is that I think we're in a very different situation now following the war that kicked off. And I think that the way the REDIII was negotiated was the first reflection of that. The fact that the Commission didn't, it sort of went back on its original proposal and said, hang on, we need to do more. The way those negotiations then played out went, I think, to a large extent back into the old ways of thinking around renewables as a cost, and this is how do we divide all of that. But I think at the same time, if you look into the real economy, that year where those negotiations happens was also the year we saw a record increase in generation capacity. Just the marketplace responded with a massive increase, a record increase, 39 terawatt hours year on year in generation, taking 9 billion out of, 11 billion out of the EU's gas import bill within 1 year. So I think we should look at the outcome on the rest negotiations as part of sort of a bigger response. So some colleagues of ours put out a report about a year ago, which I think was very well titled "Shocked into Action." EU's been shocked into action here. That doesn't answer any of the questions raised around, how does this all fit together and how is this all going to work? But I think it does tell us that we're in a very different world, and we're in a different situation where the perception of renewables as either is changing from being a cost to being a way to reduce costs, reduce the dependencies on volatile gas imports, particularly. It's got better recently, but I mean the shock is still there from last year. So I think that is one point. The other point I would make is that the rest of the world is really watching very, very closely to what Europe is doing here. How is it responding? I think there is a lot of countries questioning, can the EU pull this through? Countries like Russia think we can't. I think that's one of the reasons they did what they did, is they don't believe we can do well without fossil fuels. They thought we would crumble. So the way this is going to play out is going to be really important. I think one of the things that the EU is not really good at is just telling the rest of the world what it's doing. I mean, Europe is pushing for a global renewables target right now in New York and at COP. And one of the reactions I saw from an Indian professor think tank was, well, the EU isn't doing it itself. They thought the renewables target we had was an inspirational goal, right? So I think there's a huge gap to be filled here in terms of cut through the complexity. Yes, it's all complex. We'll get everyone to understand it, but to just start telling the simple story of what the EU is doing here, start telling that well. I think that is sort of the other sort of point I would leave you with. The other thing I'll just say, I do need to leave at the hour, so I'll stop here, but then also I'll need to jump off. So thanks again, and good seeing you all here.
Many thanks indeed, Peter. Can I just ask you one question, which is, if the President of the European Commission, I'm going to be standing for re-nomination to the President post, what is the one policy I should do in order to make sure that we achieve our renewables and GHG targets in a way that benefits the EU? What would that one thing be?
Well, I'll probably look in the area of energy markets, power markets, making sure electricity is affordable by making it possible for people to benefit from cheap renewables when they're there. I think that will be my primary focus. But that's a very difficult question. I'll need to think about it longer, but this was my quick answer.
I love it. I can see that Edith's writing it down. Ladies and gentlemen, listen, I would love to have another half an hour. I would love to have another hour because I'd really like, and I can see a follow-up debate of, okay, how are we going to achieve what Lorenzo was saying and what Edith was saying and what James was putting out in a way that is going to benefit each and every one of us in terms of increased employment and lower bills, like Peter just said. Because I think what Peter said was really, really good, is that because of the Russian invasion, because of the price spike, we've started getting into a mental space of thinking that RES and the Green Deal is a cost, not an opportunity. And I must admit, I've fallen into that trap as well, somewhat. And we have to reboot ourselves. And for the next commission really should be, as he said, which is telling the world we are actually doing what we said we'd do. And really focusing on the, this is a benefit rather than a cost. Thank you, everybody, indeed. It's been an absolutely terrific debate. I really, really enjoyed it. And Edith, Lorenzo, Jesse, James, thank you so much for being with us, and Marcia for the introduction. And we'll see you next time. Many thanks and have a great day.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Edith.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorenzo.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.